So if you acknowledge that they have an outsized influence and they're involved in intelligence and security agencies, why can you not just state today what everyone knows, and that is that the Cuban government is actively assisting the Venezuelan government in suppressing its people? That's what the Cubans are expert at in Venezuela. What else could they be contributing to the effort? That is what they're best known for on the island. That's what they have most established expertise at doing to their own people in Cuba. So you have a repressive regime in Cuba that for over 55 years has actively repressed its own people and cut down on all sorts of activity on the island. They have an outsized influence in Venezuela. They have an outsized influence in both its intelligence gathering and its security agencies. Why is it not a logical thing, even if you didn't have specific facts, which I'm sure you do, but even if we did not have it, why isn't it not a reasonable assumption that the Cubans are actively assisting the Venezuelan government in suppressing the people of Venezuela?
The fundamental responsibility for what happens in Venezuela is the Venezuelan government. That the Venezuelan, and really if we're going to focus on where the blame is, it should be for the Venezuelan government's own actions against its own people. And I think we need to focus on holding the Venezuelan government responsible for its actions.
No one disputes that, Mr. Lee, but the question is not whether the Venezuelans are ultimately responsible. Ultimately, they're the ones that ask for the assistance and are putting it into place. The question is whether the Cubans are assisting the Venezuelan government in putting in place the mechanisms that the Venezuelan government is using to repress the people of Venezuela. You cannot answer that question today?
I think the Venezuelan government charts its own course, takes advice from the Cubans on certain things, but fundamentally it's the Venezuelan government that charts its own course, for good, for ill, whether effectively or feckless.
Okay, well, Mr. Lee, I think what's obvious here is that you can't say what everyone knows, and that is that the Cuban government is helping the Venezuelan government do this, because on the one hand, while we're sanctioning Venezuelan government officials, we are lifting sanctions on Cuban officials that have made this possible. And so at the end of the day, it truly is amazing to me that in this hearing, the individual responsible for this portfolio on behalf of the U.S. government refuses to state on the record that the Cuban government is intricately involved in helping the Venezuelan government to repress its own people. This is a claim we've been willing to make about multiple countries around the world. This is a claim we've made about the Cubans in the past. This is a claim that we've made about the Cubans and that the State Department has acknowledged up until December of last year, when suddenly they stopped talking about it. I just find it unbelievable that we cannot get somebody from the Department of State who is responsible for this portfolio to openly acknowledge that the Cuban government is providing extraordinary assistance to the Venezuelan government in suppressing the people of Cuba and suppressing the people of Venezuela. And I hope that you'll reconsider. I hope the State Department will reconsider acknowledging that, because it undermines our credibility as a nation to turn a blind eye to the role that the Cuban government is playing in the suppression of the Venezuelan people. The people of Venezuela are fully aware of it. There isn't anyone that gets off a plane from Venezuela that doesn't tell you there are Cubans everywhere. And there are Cubans everywhere on the island involving governmental functions. Multiple people from Venezuela will tell you that when you go get a passport or any document, it is oftentimes a Cuban behind the counter that is coordinating it all. And to somehow think they're there as a benign force for purposes of providing moral support is quite frankly absurd. And so I hope that you'll reconsider your answer in the days to come, because it is clear to everyone who knows anything about this, and you know a lot about this, that the Cubans are helping the Venezuelans carry out these operations that they're taking against their own people. With that, I think we're done with questions, and I appreciate both of you being here today. We'll call up our second panel. And before we welcome the second panel, I'd like to ask unanimous consent that a letter by Ms. Maria Eugenia Tovar, who's the mother of Genesis Carmona Tovar, who was murdered by a gunshot on February 18, 2014, while participating in a peaceful demonstration in Venezuela, be included in the record. Now let me welcome the second panel. Douglas Farrar is a president of IBI Consultants and a senior non-resident associate of the Americas program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He works as a consultant and subject matter expert on security challenges, terrorism, and transnational organized crime in Latin America, both for the U.S. government and the private sector. Santiago Canton is an executive director of Partners for Human Rights at the Robert F. Kennedy Partner for Human Rights at Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Center. Mr. Canton manages programs around the globe that promote and protect human rights and strengthen democratic processes through strategic litigation, capacity building, and advocacy initiatives. Dr. Christopher is the Senior Director of Policy. Dr. Christopher Sabatini, is the Senior Director of Policy at the Americas Society and Council of the Americas and founder and editor-in-chief of the Hemispheric policy magazine, Americas Quarterly. Dr. Sabatini chairs the ASCOA Rule of Law Working Group. He has served as an advisor to the World Bank and the U.S. Agency for International Development. I welcome all three of you here, and I'll begin with you, Dr. Sabatini.
First of all, thank you, Senator, for the invitation. Thank you also for your dedicated commitment to speaking out on human rights violations in Venezuela, your commemoration just recently of the start of the peaceful protests a year ago, and of course the legislation that led to the executive orders. I'm going to talk about three things today. The first is the political and economic situation in Venezuela. The second is the very sad lack of a regional response to the deterioration of that situation. And the last is the recent U.S. executive orders that came and caused such a commotion, if you will, in the region. First, the political and economic situation in Venezuela. As all of the people said, it is likely to get worse. 16 years of economic mismanagement and incompetence have wreaked havoc on the Venezuelan economy. There's greater concentration in the economy on oil. It now represents 95% of exports, and lower productivity of that oil. In addition, there's a huge public sector deficit. There's over $8 billion that the Venezuelan government will have to pay to foreign creditors this year alone, with only about $20 billion in the central bank. And according to different estimates, oil has to be anywhere between $100 to $200, $120 a barrel per barrel to be able to meet the government's expectations, when of course it's around $50 a barrel. The IMF, as you mentioned, Senator, is expecting a contraction of the economy this year of 7% on top of a contraction of 2.8%. And in addition to the inflation rates we've talked about, people are now actually saying by the end of this year, inflation may reach triple digits. What makes this worse is the level of political confrontation. At every turn, when things have gotten worse with this government, people hope and expect it to moderate. Whether it was when Chavez lost a referendum, or whether it was a close election with Maduro, who only won by about 1.5% of the vote. People thought he could follow a more moderate course. He did not. When the going gets tough, he confronts. And that's been precisely the problem, and I expect because of that, the economic and political situation will get worse. Which brings me to the regional response. Despite multiple commitments among multilateral organizations to defend and protect human rights, the regional community in Venezuela has been mute. What that means is that by standing aside, as this president disarticulates democratic institutions, attacks political opponents, and jails mayors, the regional community has been an enabler to the violation of human rights in Venezuela. That has to be recognized, and yet they are violating their own commitments to a number of multilateral organizations. The only voices that have spoken up were Juan Manuel Santos, the president of Colombia, and 5 former presidents who signed a letter just last week expressing their concern about the confrontation, including Oscar Arias Sanchez, including former President Zedillo, Calderon, and Fernando Henrique Cardozo. But, which brings me to the executive order. It's important to distinguish, as everyone has so far, that these are only very targeted sanctions against people. Unfortunately, the language that was used as a result of bureaucratic boilerplate became a red herring. But what's really sad about this is that in 2009, the U.S. pulled the visas of 15 Honduran officials of the de facto government of Micheletti. At that time, they didn't use the language they're using now of calling it intervention or impertinent intervention in the internal affairs of a country and respecting national sovereignty. They applauded that decision. I think it's worth asking regional leaders in the hemisphere, why is it okay to pull visas of a de facto government that came to power in a coup in Honduras, but why are they not willing to stand by the U.S. when it does the exact same thing in Venezuela? And what is wrong with allowing a government to be able to say to human rights abusers, we don't want you to come to Disneyland. We don't want you to do your banking in our. Again, I would like to say that I think this is a very, very sad moment in terms of the regional commitment to democracy, which is eroding when over only 15 years ago, they stood up collectively and denounced violations, very same violations by Roberto Fujimori, and rolled them back. More in depth, I'm also concerned about the way the media has portrayed us. Again, the language around the executive order was problematic. But the media has presented this as giving Maduro steam, as giving him sort of bait to be able to roll back democratic institutions and build new political momentum. The truth is, that isn't true. His disapproval rating still stands at 70%, and his approval rating still stands at 23%. In other words, this has not become a political boon to the president, but yet regional leaders and the media insist on that it is. I'll end on one last point. While the language about Venezuela being a national security risk may have been a little overblown, I would argue that it is a security risk in the region. For the first time, we face the specter of a failed state in a large South American country just south of us. And that is unprecedented, and getting out of it and how you rebuild eventually is unimaginable. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sabatini and Mr. Kenton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to appear before you today to share some information regarding the human rights situation in Venezuela. I have presented in a 20-page written statement with very detailed information about the human rights situation. So in this brief presentation, I will just refer to the most important violations. The rule of law in Venezuela has been in a downward spiral for the last 15 years. The signs of this decline have been unequivocal: increasing concentration of power, lack of independence of the judiciary, restricting freedom of expression, excessive and lethal use of force and other forms of restriction to peaceful assembly, widespread use of torture, restricting civic space and financing of NGOs, and prosecuting under false charges political opposition leaders, and closing the door to any outside monitoring. Violations for freedom of expression. Journalists face constant threats and harassment. The state exercises tight control over media outlets and has been ranked 137 out of 180 countries in the 2015 World Press Freedom Index. The UN Secretary General, the High Commissioner of Human Rights of the UN, and the Special Rapporteur on the right to freedom of opinion and expression of the UN have criticized the Venezuelan government for limiting free expression. Over 259 incidents of threats and harassment of journalists were reported between January and April 2014. In recent years, state authorities have tightened restrictions on television and radio through forced closures, fines, judicial cases, and economic pressures. From 2013, 13 newspapers stopped operating, and many more are at risk of closure now due to print paper shortages that the government is responsible for. Violations to freedom of association and assembly. Peaceful opposition protesters are routinely violently assaulted by the Venezuelan police and military, the latter of which was recently granted explicit power to use force to control peaceful demonstrations. Law prohibits Venezuelan human rights defenders from receiving international support if they defend political rights or monitor the performance of public bodies. Protests have reignited since last February of this year. Violent repression and the use of military force during this demonstration have already resulted in a fatal victim. On February 24, Robert Roa Núñez, a 14-year-old high school student, was killed by a gunshot to the head. Lack of judicial independence. Since the National Assembly passed a law that increased the membership of the Supreme Court from 20 to 32 justices, its members have publicly rejected the principle of separation of powers, and the judiciary has acted as another arm of the executive branch to advance the government's political agenda. Arbitrary arrests and detentions. According to the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights of the UN, more than 70 people have been arbitrarily detained or arrested in Venezuela over the last year alone. According to official information, approximately 3,000 people were arrested between February and June 2004 in the context of the public protest that took place across the country. Many were denied access to a lawyer, and some remain in pre-trial detention for several months. Dozens of students remain also in detention. One of the individuals that were arrested in connection to the February 2014 protest is Leopoldo López, leader of the opposition party Voluntad Popular. He has remained in pre-trial detention with fabricated charges. A month after, the mayor of San Cristóbal, Daniel Ceballos, from the same party, was also arrested. In August 2014, the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detentions concluded that the detention of both Lopez and Ceballos was arbitrary and demanded its release. Recently, a couple of months ago, the Committee Against Torture of the UN also demanded the release of them. 1 year after Leopoldo Lopez's arrest, Caracas Mayor Antonio Ledesma, the second most voted person in Venezuela after Maduro, was also arrested on fabricated charges. Torture and cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment in prisons. The UN Committee Against Torture expressed alarm regarding reported acts of torture and its treatment of persons arrested in connection with the demonstration of February of last year. These acts of torture include beatings, electric shocks, burns, suffocation, sexual violence, and threats. Just earlier this month, the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights granted protective measures in favor of 2 political prisoners in the Trump prison that you referred to it, Senator. It is important to note that these type of measures are only granted in extreme cases of urgency, gravity, and threat of irreparable harms. Taking the violation of political participation, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to finish very quickly with this presentation. There is a violation of the right to political participation. As you know, Leopoldo Lopez was not allowed to run in the election. And in addition to Leopoldo Lopez, just recently Julio Borges, another member of the opposition, was also expelled from Congress. Maria Corina Machado was expelled a few months ago. So there is very difficult opportunity for the opposition to participate freely in politics. Mr. Chairman, the disregard by the Venezuelan government of the human rights of its people is absolute. The human rights situation in Venezuela is critical, and not only for opposition leaders, but for the population in general. The report by the UN Committee Against Torture from last December indicates that almost 1,300, and I insist, 1,300 extrajudicial killings took place in Venezuela between 2012 and 2013. And the prevailing impunity does not contribute to improve the situation. According to government information of the approximately 30,000 human rights violations reported to the authorities between 2011 and 2014, only 3% have been prosecuted. The account I have just presented is only but a fraction of the grave and systematic violations that are taking place in Venezuela. It is time for the international community to ensure, through multilateral and bilateral efforts, that democracy and the rule of law are respected. In 2001, the Hemisphere adopted a democratic charter to address challenges such as the ones Venezuela is going through. The U.S. government should work together with the OAS and UNASUR and the leaders of the region to ensure that the democratic charter is respected. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Farr. Thank you, Chairman Rubio, for the chance to be here today to discuss the accelerating crisis in Venezuela and its implications for the United States and regional security. I speak only on behalf of myself, and my views are not necessarily those of CSIS or ISC. I want to focus on Venezuela's regional role rather than its internal problems, because I believe this is where the strategic threat to the United States actually resides. There is little doubt that Venezuela has for a decade now posed a significant threat not only to U.S. security interests in the Western Hemisphere, but to the survival of democracy and the rule of law in the region. A recent investigation by Veja, a respected Brazilian magazine, shows that Venezuela, with the help of Argentina, actively tried to help Iran's nuclear program in violation of international sanctions. More than a dozen Venezuelan officials have been publicly identified by U.S. law enforcement as being directly involved in drug trafficking or the support of terrorist groups. The threat originating in Venezuela is not confined to Venezuela. The late Hugo Chavez, acting in concert with his allies Rafael Correa in Ecuador, Evo Morales in Bolivia, Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, and Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner in Argentina, set out to redefine the political landscape in Latin America. And to a large degree, they have been successful. Unfortunately, the changes wrought under the banner of socialism for the 21st century have brought massive corruption, rising violence, and repression. Venezuela is the indisputable leader and primary axis around which the others revolve. Venezuela and its allies have moved perilously close to becoming criminalized states. That is, states where the senior leadership is involved with and act in concert with transnational organized crime groups as a matter of statecraft. The Maduro administration is the central component of a multi-state ongoing criminal enterprise carried out in concert with Iran and a growing Russian presence, whose primary strategic objective is to cling to power by whatever means necessary and harm the United States and its allies. In this endeavor, it has embraced the FARC, Hezbollah, ETA of Spain, the Sinaloa cartel, and other terrorist and drug trafficking organizations, and I repeat, as a matter of state policy, not as rogue elements acting on their own.
The stakes in the unfolding crisis in Venezuela for U.S. interests and the survival of democracy in Latin America are high. The consequences of the growth of this poisonous Bolivarian criminal enterprise is lethal. Few understood this better than Alberto Nisman, the courageous Argentine prosecutor who was investigating the 1994 Iran-backed bombing of the AMIA Jewish Center in Buenos Aires. Before being murdered on January 18th, Nisman had documented the Bolivarian-Iran ties across the Western Hemisphere, including 2 attempted attacks backed by Iran in the United States. Iran, identified by successive U.S. administrations as a state sponsor of terror, has expanded its political alliances, diplomatic presence, trade initiatives, military and intelligence programs in the Bolivarian axis, primarily through its deep ties with Venezuela. The Iranian Constitution, first pointed out to be by prosecutor Nisman, is an extraordinary document in which Iran stakes its claim to world domination in the name of Allah. The preamble to the Iranian Constitution states, and I quote, "With due consideration for the Islamic elements of the Iranian Revolution, which has been a movement for the victory of all oppressed peoples who are confronted with aggressors, this Constitution shall pave the way for the perpetuation of this revolution within and outside the country. This Constitution seeks to lay the groundwork for the creation of a single world nation and perpetuate the struggle to make this nation a reality for all the world's needy and oppressed nations." That's quite a statement for a constitution. This is the country with whom Venezuela and the Bolivarian states have chosen to ally themselves while seeking to eradicate U.S. influence. U.S. influence is being replaced by a lethal doctrine of asymmetrical warfare inspired by authoritarian government seeking perpetual power and nurtured by Iran and its overt desire to violently spread its brand of Islamic revolution. In addition to serving as a gateway for Iran's presence in the region, Venezuela has also been the primary conduit for Russia's growing presence in the region, something that is a growing concern in our national security community, and I deal with this at length in my written statement. In my written testimony, I detail many of the other cases to substantiate the statements that I make here. But I want to close with the words of the legendary Manhattan District Attorney Robert Morgenthau as he retired in 2009 after decades of public service, including the pursuit of numerous and ongoing criminal investigations into the Venezuelan government's criminal activities. He said, "Let there be no doubt that Hugo Chavez leads not only a corrupt government, but one staffed with terrorist sympathizers. The government has strong ties to narco-trafficking and money laundering and reportedly plays an active role in the transshipment of narcotics and the laundering of narcotics proceeds in exchange for payment to corrupt government officials. Under the even less competent hands of Nicolás Maduro, the situation described by Morgenthau 6 years ago have grown considerably worse, as has the threat." Thank you very much.
Thank you all three for being here. Let me start with you, Dr. Sabatini. I wanted to ask you why you have shared in your testimony something that Senator Boxer brought up earlier, and that is the silence of communities in Latin America and in the Western Hemisphere to what's happening in Venezuela. You compared it to the Honduran case that occurred back in 2009, if I'm correct, and how that was met. Why, in your mind, why the silence from virtually everyone in the hemisphere, with the exception of President Santos, who condemned a specific arrest? But why the silence?
It's a good question, Senator. I have several theories. I think first, there has occurred in the last 10 years a proliferation of new regional organizations, led primarily by Brazil. There's the South American Union, UNASUR, and there's the Latin American Caribbean Union, CELAC. Both of those are intended to sort of marginalize the United States from those discussions, and not to wax too academic here, but those institutions actually lack a fundamental element of a multilateral institution. They do not ask their member countries to surrender any part of their sovereignty for a larger collective good. If you look at their founding documents, if you look at their statements, they always talk about how national sovereignty is supreme. So I actually think that we have gone backwards in the region. We talk about popular sovereignty. We're back to the point when Latin American countries assert this principle of non-intervention, which can have very dangerous consequences, because that principle of popular sovereignty evolved after World War II to protect the horrendous things that happened in Nazi Germany. So I think, first of all, there's been actually a philosophical institutional shift within the region. Second, I think that the region simply does not want to have the United States involved, is actively seeking to marginalize to do that. To give an example, and to refer to what was said earlier about the need for election observation, be very careful. UNASUR's election observation program explicitly says that they are there to accompany the Electoral Commission, which if your Electoral Commission is vitiated or politicized means you're just going there as a rubber stamp. So it's very important who monitors those elections. And the last point, there is certainly a level of ideological sympathy and affinity with a number of these governments with the Chavez, which is a shame. Because while I believe Dilma Rousseff and the PT may be a genuinely leftist, even social democratic government, basically Venezuela is a military government led by a group of thugs. But unfortunately, they cannot make that distinction. And one last point, there are also very tight economic relations between. Brazil benefits deeply from agricultural exports, investment in infrastructure, and other things that sort of have made it very, very difficult to break this tie with Venezuela.
Dr. Sabatini, you also touched upon the drug trade, and as we know, if you watch the flights that come out of Colombia and South America and Central America and ultimately are transited into the United States, many of them overfly Venezuela. It is hard to believe that those flights are occurring without the knowledge of someone in Venezuela. In fact, the allegations and some of the proof is very clear that the Venezuelan government actually allows these flights to pay for protection money in exchange for being able to use airspace in Venezuela. If you don't pay the protection money, you may be shot down. If you pay the protection money to either a corrupt individual or to the Maduro government, you can overfly that airspace. Is that an accurate assessment of the role Venezuela is playing in the drug trade?
It's a very accurate assessment. If we look at a map, basically Venezuela is crosshatched by flights that are coming from Colombia or leaving from Venezuela, mostly to go to West Africa, but now increasingly going to the Caribbean. Again, raising 2 points. One is why Venezuela is, as you say, since it is so closely tied to the drug trade at a state level, and particularly at a military level, why this is a security risk to the region. And so Brazil and other countries ignore what's going on at their own peril. They will be most affected. And not coincidentally, one of the highest per capita consumers of cocaine today is Brazil.
Mr. Cantone, you described a Venezuela where there's no freedom of expression, where there is no freedom of assembly and association, where there's a lack of any sort of judicial independence, where there's arrests and detentions of opponents of the government, where there's degrading and cruel treatment of those opponents when in prison. Going deeper than that, we know that if you're a member of the opposition, you have virtually no access to the airwaves, no independent press. They're denied things like bulk paper imports, so they can't even print. You're forced to sell to owners that are friendly to the regime. Just a moment ago, I struggled to get the Department of State of the United States to acknowledge that Venezuela was no longer a democracy. In essence, democracy is more than just elections. Why should I continue to consider what they have in Venezuela today as a democracy, given the fact that all of beyond having an election, which may or may not be even valid in some cases because of manipulation of the ballot, all the other underlying conditions of a democracy are not present. In essence, there cannot be a democracy unless both sides have free and fair access to the people who vote. Why should is Venezuela still a democracy?
I say, my question is more academic than practical to some extent. Maduro is president elected by the popular vote. Nobody can argue against that. Maybe someone can argue that the elections were not free and fair. That's a possibility, because he won only for 1.5. But he was elected by the popular vote. All the other conditions of democracy are not there. I completely agree with you on that aspect. There's no independence of the judiciary. The legislation is just a rubber stamp institution, and there is constantly violations of human rights in the country.
So let me rephrase my question this way, and I get your point. Let's assume, and I don't accept this, but let's assume that the election was free and fair. Is Nicolás Maduro today governing Venezuela as a Democrat?
No, absolutely not. And rather than using the word democracy that can give space for ambiguity, I would say there is absolutely no rule of law in Venezuela.
So formally, on paper and institutionally, Venezuela has a democratic form of government in how it's being governed today. It is no longer being governed as a democracy.
Correct.
Okay. And then, Mr. Farrar, I wanted to talk to you about the national security aspects of this. Actually, before I go to you, let me just finish this with Mr. Cantone. I know you didn't get to it or couldn't get to it in your written statement because of the limited amount of time. Can you briefly describe, as you wrote in your testimony, the conditions that Leopoldo Lopez now faces in captivity?
I mean, everybody in jail in Venezuela is in a very, very serious situation and very grave situation on the personal integrity and right to life.
Is he in solitary confinement?
He's in solitary confinement, and only a few weeks ago there was an attempt to get into his cell by a gang of thugs in the prison. Nothing unfortunately happened. I spoke with Leopoldo's mother only a week ago. He's okay condition, but by being in a jail in Venezuela, everybody, and particularly if you are Leopoldo Lopez, your life is at risk.
Is he allowed visits from his family on a regular basis?
Not on a very regular basis. Her mother can visit him once in a while, as well as his wife, but it's not very regular.
Okay, Mr. Ferron, I wanted to talk about the national security components. First of all, I think it's important at the outset to point to something that you did, and that is that throughout the 1970s until 1993, Argentina had a robust nuclear relationship with Iran, and that the current Iranian reactors were retrofitted and upgraded with Argentine nuclear technology. That's accurate?
Yes, sir.
Okay, can you describe the nexus that exists today in your mind between Argentina, Iran, and Venezuela?
Well, I think that Iran desperately wants to get its nuclear program up and running, and it was until the 1994 AMIA bombing, there was a very close exchange program between Iranian scientists and Argentinian scientists, etc. Prosecutor Niesman identified the cutting off of that relationship under U.S. and European pressure in 1993 as the trigger factor that set off the AMIA bombing in Buenos Aires in 1994. So when Iran needed to get back in the game, or wanted desperately to get back into the game, they approached Venezuela, Hugo Chavez specifically, with Nestor Kirchner, Christina's husband and predecessor, to begin opening the dialogue. As the recent Veja investigation shows, President Chavez said immediately, yes, let me do this, get on it. Nestor Kirchner was not particularly interested. In 2009 with Christina, they revisited it, and there was a steady flow, or there has been a steady flow of Argentine scientists, nuclear folks going to Venezuela. My understanding from talking to people very familiar with Argentina's nuclear program is that Iran has been interested in trying to recruit the entire team of scientists. They don't want it ones or twos, they want an entire team, and they're simply not willing to go. So that hasn't happened yet. But I think Venezuela, it was the necessary bridge to bring the United States Kirchner government into contact with Iran, and then you had the whole ongoing scandal with the Memorandum of Understanding and other things that happened in Argentina as a result of that growing closeness, and ultimately you have Prosecutor Niesman's accusation that the President Kirchner and her foreign minister and others had illegally agreed with Iran to get the Interpol red notices dropped against senior Iranian officials in exchange for oil, etc. And you end up with Prosecutor Niesman dead. But I think that in that entire process, the main interlocutor, the bridge between Iran and Argentina, has been and was very active with Venezuela, particularly President Chavez while he was alive, and ongoing with President Maduro.
Okay, so we've established that there's a nexus there. Let me ask you about this group called the FARC, which is largely operational within Colombia. This is a drug trafficking narco guerrilla group currently engaged in peace negotiations with the Colombian government, but they do things like extortion and kidnapping and bombings and so forth in addition to their narco trafficking activities, correct?
Yes, sir. They are one of three organizations that's both designated as a major drug trafficking organization and a terrorist organization by the U.S. government.
So the FARC is treated by the United States government as both a terrorist organization and a narco-trafficking organization. Are they not present in Venezuela? Do they not have a presence in Venezuela today? And if so, what is the nature of it?
They have a significant presence. I think that captured FARC documents beginning in 2008 with the death of Raul Reyes, the FARC commander who was killed in Ecuador. We got about 600 gigabytes of data for the first time on the internal FARC communications. And what was shocking in that, I worked with both the Colombian government and others on analyzing a chunk of those documents. What was really eye-opening was the intense level of senior contact between the FARC Secretariat, the General Secretariat, and not only President Chavez directly, but his entire cabinet, including Diosdado Cabello, Maduro, and all the others who are still there, and the very intense relationship at the same level with the Ecuadorian government of Rafael Correa. Those were the two sort of really significant findings, but you see there that the Venezuelan government not only gave them shelter, it offered to set up joint businesses with them, it helped finance many of their activities, it carried their political water for them as far as trying to set up these different front groups. It hosted their main front group, which is the Bolivarian, the CCB, the Continental Bolivariana, and the founding documents are in the FARC documents that were captured, where the FARC complains that no one knows that this front group is a FARC group, but they describe how it was founded in the basement of the presidential palace with President Chavez, personally present. So it's a very, very organic link. It goes to the highest levels, and there's nothing non-state about that relationship. The FARC is viewed, much like Iran views Hezbollah, as a matter of state policy, as a non-state actor that responds directly to them.
What about the links between Venezuela and Hezbollah?
I think that you've seen over time something that was initially largely dismissed, thanks to the Drug Enforcement Administration and the cases that have become public over the last few years. You see very, very tight links. You have Ayman Juma and other very specific cases where the Hezbollah operatives were buying cocaine from the FARC, and much of that money is ending up back places like the Lebanese Canadian Bank that have since been closed because that money was detected, and it's often not as direct a link as people I discuss with in the policy world would like to see, but the money, in my mind, is, well, are they card-carrying Hezbollah people that are buying the cocaine? Who cares? The money ends up in Hezbollah accounts back in Lebanon. Does it really matter whether the person who brokered that deal with the FARC has an ID card that says FARC, or whether he's sympathetic enough to move that money back to Hezbollah? I don't think, in my mind, there's no distinction necessary there, but it becomes a very intense policy debate within this administration over what constitutes Hezbollah. My argument is that you simply need to look where the money ends up and who benefited from it, and it doesn't matter who the intermediaries were identified specifically as that group.
And my last question is about the state-owned company, PDVSA, Petróleo de Venezuela. How does the Venezuelan government under Maduro, the Maduro regime, use PDVSA as a source of influence, activity, laundering, etc.? How is that entity used both in the region and around the world?
Well, I think the Bank of Andorra findings are extraordinarily important, because I've been hearing for the last 3 or 4 years that Andorra was where PDVSA siphoned its money into. They have incredibly tough bank secrecy laws, and nothing had come out for a significant period of time. I think that PDVSA has become sort of the piggy bank that no longer has much cash in it. But what you see is an architecture created around the region, particularly with Maduro's allies in Nicaragua, Daniel Ortega and Salvador Sanchez Seren, and the remnants of the Communist Party in El Salvador, where you have architectures built up in which no oil was actually moved, but which they used to launder hundreds of millions of dollars a year. And simply looking at the financials of those companies, they're absurd. There are almost no legal imports coming in. For example, Alba Petróleos in El Salvador began with $1 million as this joint state enterprise with PDVSA owning 60% of the company and Alba Petróleos owning 40%. They had $1 million in 2007. Their earnings statement for 2013 was $863 million with no visible legitimate imports. That's a rather significant increase in your earnings. Daniel Ortega has said publicly that he gets $500 million a year from PDVSA essentially as a personal slush fund. So I think that, and they set up with that an architecture which allows the FARC, the Sinaloa cartel, Hezbollah, many other groups to launder money through the architecture that PDVSA has established.
Okay, my last question let me just ask you one more. And I alluded to this earlier, law enforcement report about the use of shipments from Venezuela to Syria to send bulk cash, both cash raised from the Arab expatriate community, but also cash collected through trafficking of drugs and exacting bribes from drug traffickers, and that money being sent to Assad. Are you aware of that report? Are you aware of those allegations? And if not, would that surprise you, knowing the nature of the regime?
I have heard the allegations. I have not seen documentation on it. I think that given the fact that when Chavez was most active in his direct engagement with Iran, the direct flight they set up went from Caracas to Damascus to Tehran back to Caracas. It's clear that there's a very strong link. If you look at the literature, Chavez had a very robust relationship with Assad. That has not changed, and Maduro doesn't have the money, but clearly he has carrying on the same commitments that Chavez entered into. And I think that we have seen numerous cases of massive amounts of bulk cash being shipped back, usually on Iranian ships, which are untraceable once they get to Iran. And some of that money would end up with Assad is not remotely...
Is there still a direct flight between Caracas and Tehran?
No, sir. That ended in 2011.
Okay. So my last question, and I don't know who to direct this to, but any of you feel free to ask. I asked at the end of the last panel about Cuba's influence in Venezuela, or its presence in Venezuela. And while I was able to get admission that there was an outsized influence, I could not get them to admit that the Cubans were actually involved in directing or helping the Venezuelan regime, the Maduro regime, oppress their own people. So let me just ask all of you to comment on both the size, the scope of the Cuban presence in Venezuela. I hear from Venezuelans that are traveling back and others that it's an extraordinary presence, that you cannot miss it. And secondly, the nature of that, to the extent you're able to comment. And I guess, Dr. Sabatino, if you have anything to add to that.
I'll start first. It is real. It is, and I'm going to tell perhaps an anecdote which illustrates it. A regular annual dinner with Cubans in the UN mission, who, as we all know, are spies. And one time, I was sort of chiding them a little bit, saying it must be difficult to be a client state of Venezuela because they're so incompetent. And they, of course, took umbrage at them being called a client state. And I said, and they pushed back. And I said, yeah, but they can't manage it. You guys are real professionals, you're good spies, you do things very well. There's a long pause, and finally, literally, they said, yes, but we're training them. Which I think is precisely the point. They are training, they are deeply embedded in the intelligence services, they're deeply embedded in the foreign ministry. I love that they often talk about their sharing sports trainers. I don't know what sports trainers are, but clearly that's a euphemism for something else that's there. And of course they also have the medical doctors, which by the way helps underwrite the Cuban pharmaceutical industry. When I was recently on a trip to Cuba, something I had never thought of is the doctors that are being sent to Venezuela are writing prescriptions for Cuban drugs that are then shipped. So it sort of also benefits the pharmaceutical industry in Cuba. It's real, and it's and as I say, I have a first-hand account that they're there to train and they're there to advise.
I agree, it is real. In the particular case of the Inter-American System of Human Rights, the information I had when I was at the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights was that all the movement of Venezuela to withdraw from the Inter-American System of Human Rights was orchestrated by Cuba. And that over the last 2 years, as you know, Venezuela left the Inter-American System for the Protection of Human Rights, and that was because Cuba initiated all the process.
I would just add one thing. I agree with both my colleagues. One of the things that the Cubans were brought in to do, and you see it not only in Venezuela, but certainly in Bolivia and Ecuador, perhaps more pronounced because they're smaller societies, is that in those countries, and I grew up in Bolivia, if you were someone of stature and you got arrested, you had a social network that would get you out of prison. I never worried during the military dictatorships in Bolivia. I was picked up, I was going to school with the sons of colonels, and there's a social network that would get those people out. The Cubans were brought in to break that social network. They don't care who your uncle went to school with. They don't care who you went to class with. They don't care about any of that. And that has facilitated in all three of these countries the ability to throw people like Leopoldo Lopez in prison with no social network that can mobilize to get them out. The Cubans were brought in to essentially slice through those existing sort of safety net cords that had survived through the dictatorships and helped a lot of people get sanctuary because they are beholden to no one and they know it and they can just tell you to walk away and that's it. So it's a very important function they play besides, as was pointed out, being incredibly active at the very senior levels.
Well, I guess I asked all these questions because while a lot of people were taken aback by the language of the President's announcement last week that Venezuela poses a national security threat, perhaps a better way to have phrased it, and I understand they're constrained by bureaucratic necessities, but is not that Venezuela poses a threat per se. The people of Venezuela have no animosity towards the United States, at least the vast majority, the enormous and overwhelming majority, and certainly don't pose a threat to the country. But the Maduro regime, as has been described here today, is an anti-American one, is a serial human rights violator, is one that governs undemocratically. It's one that is helping, and may continue to be helping Iran try to evade international sanctions and advance its nuclear program. It's one that's involved in aiding both a terrorist and narco group called the FARC by giving them safe haven and support within their own territory. It's one that's involved, by the way, in openly providing safe passage for drug traffickers for drugs that are ultimately destined for the United States. It's one that actively supports financially Hezbollah, and it's one that uses its state-owned enterprise to foment and support anti-American governments in the region. And last but not least, it's one that's completely affected by a foreign government that has flooded it with sports trainers, or more accurately known as spies and agents of repression, that allow it to crack down on its own people and also further the interest of that country over that of the people of Venezuela. That sounds like the Maduro regime is not an insignificant threat to the national security of the United States when you view it in this context. This is not just a nation that is failing economically because of incompetent leaders, and it is certainly that, but it is also one in the grips of a regime that actively supports global terrorism, that actively supports one of the most dangerous developments of the last 20 years, which is Iran's nuclear ambition, that actively supports a group that's both a narco-terrorism group and also just a flat-out terrorist group. It's one that one that represses its own people brutally with the assistance of the Cuban government. This does not sound to me like something that should be taken lightly, despite the fact that it doesn't receive the attention it deserves. It does sound like, not Venezuela, but the Maduro regime poses a real national security risk, not just to the United States, but to the region. Would anyone disagree with that assessment or elaborate on it?
I agree, but the issue is how to address that problem, and I believe it's better if the U.S. acts together with the other countries of the region, with the OES, with UNASUR, than acting alone. I'm in agreement, and we were discussing with Chris this before, I'm in agreement with the sanctions, but it's important for the U.S. to have a very active diplomacy with the OES and UNASUR. Over the last next few months, there are very important issues happening in the region. There is a new change of the Secretary General of the OES. The last Secretary General, Jose Miguel Insulza, failed during 10 years. His tenure at the OES is the same time of the weakness of the destruction of democracy in Venezuela. There is the Summit of the Americas in just a couple of weeks, and there is the election internally in Venezuela. So I think it is important for the U.S. to work together with the other countries of the region. I know it's not easy, I know this is not the best planning, but it's the best way to approach this situation.
And Mr. Canton, I would not disagree. I would love nothing more than to see the nations of the region condemn what's happening in Venezuela. I would love to see nothing more than at least one country, at least one, come forward and say what's going on in Venezuela is outrageous, and as a neighboring country, we're outraged by it. The problem is that we haven't seen any of that occur, and in the interim, U.S. national security is at stake. And so, in fact, as Senator Menendez pointed earlier, about a year ago, the administration did not want to do sanctions because they wanted to give time for this UNASUR process to work. And the problem with that process, of course, was that they went in and basically treated both sides as moral equals, when they were not. One side was unarmed civilians protesting conditions in Venezuela, and the other side were armed with sticks and clubs and guns and were beating them, and they also happen to have the power of government on their side. And so while I agree with you, and I share with you the hope that we would be joined by other nations, recent history doesn't hold much hope that that's going to happen, and I think it's to the great shame of the nations in this hemisphere who stand by silently and are watching this happen. Anyone else care to elaborate on what my statement a moment?
I would fully agree, and I wrote a paper that the Army War College published in 2012 saying that the criminalized states of Latin America should be considered a Tier 1 national security threat. And I think that has been, because not only, as I said in my testimony, not only Venezuela, it's a network of countries now acting in concert with extra-regional actors, with the primary unifying factor in all of their ideologies is a hatred for the United States and a firm belief in their public doctrine that the use of WMD against the United States is acceptable military doctrine and necessary military doctrine. I think, because we don't take people seriously when they tell us what they want to do, that that's a serious oversight on our part, and that as they move forward, that strategic goal on their end has not changed.
I'll just add quickly, I agree with you, and for so long, this administration, which I support, has first talked about the new era of partnership in the hemisphere. The truth is, partners don't treat partners like Brazil and others are treating us. They don't denounce perhaps inflammatory language, but an action that in fact they embraced only a few years earlier when it came to Honduras. I think we need to find who our allies are in the region and work with them carefully to find a comfort zone where they can start to engage in this. Because I agree with you, Venezuela is a national security threat, probably more to the region than it is the United States, which makes it all the more ironic that they're the ones who are criticizing us for saying it.
Well, I appreciate your insights today. I think if anything, this hearing, I hope, will remind my colleagues and the American people about what we're facing in our own hemisphere. Number one is just an astronomical level of human rights abuses and an erosion of democracy, which, by the way, is not only contained in Venezuela. You find that erosion of democracy in Bolivia and in Ecuador and in Nicaragua, and certainly the total absence of it in Cuba. It's one of those startling new developments we've seen after 20 years of democratic progress, where people come to power through an election and then immediately undermine all of the institutions necessary for a vibrant democracy. It's one we've ignored for far too long. The second point is I hope people realize that in our own hemisphere there is a regime that is actively supporting and profiting from the trafficking of drugs that ultimately wind up in our streets, that is actively supporting, openly supporting, elements that are both narco-terrorists but also just flat-out terrorists who have killed and maimed not just people in this region but oftentimes Americans. That in this region there is a regime that is an active supporter of Iran's nuclear ambitions. That in this region there is a regime surrounded by a level of enablers and cronies who steal all this money from the Venezuelan people, who benefit from access to power in Venezuela, and then spend weekends and holidays parading up and down the streets of Miami, enjoying their ill-found gains. And so that's why I'm supportive of the bill we passed last year and supportive of the President's decisions. And I hope people realize that all the problems of the world are not in the Middle East. All the problems of the world are not only in Asia or in Europe. There are real and significant problems in our own hemisphere that impact life in America. And the last point I hope people will take away from today is that we believe that the future of Venezuela belongs to the people of Venezuela. In a perfect and ideal world, the world that we're pushing towards, the Venezuelan people, through the ballot box, will replace these leaders with ones of their own choosing, which will help Venezuela fulfill its destiny as a prosperous, peaceful, and free country. That's not the direction it's headed in today. And while we cannot mandate the conditions in Venezuela, nor should we try, and it is not our intention to do so, we will certainly should lift our voice anytime human rights are being violated, especially in such a grotesque manner, and we will certainly condemn those who are benefiting and profiting from these abuses and then coming to our own shores to enjoy those benefits from the money they've stolen from their own people. And last but not least, we cannot ignore, despite the recent opening, the Cuban influence in Venezuela and the role that they're playing. Nicolás Maduro recently said that the United States was planning to invade Venezuela, which anyone familiar with U.S. policy just knows how absurd it is, and how ridiculous a statement that is. But I would say to you that there is an invasion going on in Venezuela, and it's an invasion of Cubans, of Cuban agents and Cuban government officials that have infiltrated the highest levels of its government, who provide personal protection to Nicolás Maduro and Chavez before him, who control the official documents of the government, who are training their sports department that are known as their repressive regime, and these things are happening as well, and it should give us insight into the true nature of the Cuban government. With that, again, I appreciate you being here today, your insights, the work that went into your statements. The record is going to remain open until the close of business on Thursday, March 19th. For any future submissions, you may receive questions from other members, and I would encourage you to answer those so we can get them officially in the record. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.